How's it going, everyone? My name is Chad Chapman, and this is part 3 of the YouTube series. I followed a Laravel tutorial but used my own framework instead. And today we'll be going over the section working with databases. So the goal of this exercise is to see how my framework compares to their database migration system. Just a little bit, not too much detail. There's one thing I know Laravel does differently, and that is if you go into the migrations, I'll have to click around and try to hunt and figure out what table is being created. So I'm thinking about, for a good item is to append the name to the class for migrations. So we'll make a note, append table name to migration class. And I'm thinking about having a set to where you have like migration timestamp and then create table, update table, drop table, whatever the goal of the migration. So let's cabbage us begin.
We have these sample chirps that we're passing to our view layer. Again, this is our controller, the C of the MVC structure, and we're passing this to our view layer. But these chirps are just hard-coded values that we're passing from this controller. They don't actually exist in the database. So when you're creating an application, when you're putting it out onto the web, most of the time you need a database in order to save things that can then live forever, or at least until someone deletes their chirp. In lesson 2, we talked about how we have this database.SQLite, the same one that was generated for us when we created the initial Laravel application. When that Laravel installer scaffolded it out, database.SQLite is perfect for our local development environment because it's a real database. Everything exists in this single file. So the TLDR is SQLite is a great option for a database, and if you did want to move it into production using a different database, you really don't have to think too much about what that changes. Laravel just handles all that for you. But let's go ahead and get started with interacting with the database. And to do that, we need this little thing called migrations. In fact, we have a directory already enabled for us that has some migrations by default, but we're going to go ahead and create one from scratch. You can think of migrations as Laravel's way of interacting, creating, modifying, even rolling back your database changes automatically. So it's a file-based way of saying, hey, here's what is happening or has happened with your database. We're going to open up that terminal again using our...
So, let's see here. Let's do things a little bit differently. So, let's do this. So, MySQL and Apache. All right, so now let's go into I want to be able to see what's going on. There it is. Not sure why I wasn't liking it. So let's create a new database. Chirper. And then It's the same purpose. This is a development database because you're run it within XAMPP. Could not find driver. All right, so now let's see here. All right. This Windows thing is just really annoying. All right. All right, so here's our database.
Our handy PHP artisan command, we're going to say make migration. And
also, I'm using my own official user guide to help me along the way.
again, most of the time I could just leave this blank, and if I was to press enter, it would give us the standard format of what a migration might be named and how you would input that into this field. So I'm just going to say that this is create chirps table, because that's what...
All right, so right now we have it set up so where we do PHP console. And then chirps.
What we're going to do, we're going to save chirps to our database. So we need a chirps table, and this is plural, just like it gave us a prompt for. Now that went ahead and created that file for us. So if we were to open up that database directory again, we should have a new migration. Yes, this last one, and it's time-stamped as well for when...
And one thing is, this might be a good thing to start adding factories. Which is basically, from what I understand, so if we go into Cedars, it's basically this part right here, but it's abstracted away out of the actual Cedar class, and then this is actually becomes reusable.
When we created it, create chirps migration. Here's where we get to add the columns that we would need in our database for our chirps. You can think of this as how your database needs to be defined. What things do you generally store with a chirp entity? Now, first, most of the time, a chirp would be associated with a user. We need to know who actually proceeded to chirp. Now, Laravel gives us a handy table column for this. We can say column foreign ID. And now here is where we can pass in the ID of another column in our database or another table in our database. For example, I'm going to say this is the user ID.
So let's see here. Migrations. We can do that. Let's see how they do it.
And I'm going to make this nullable. Now, this isn't recommended in a production database, but just so that we can continue moving forward with our application.
Column, ID, and table. Let's continue.
We don't necessarily need a user just for testing purposes.
Somehow mine is way different from that one. But what I can do here is alright, so what we're going to do is table and then timestamps.
Says we want to be able to create chirps, edit them, delete them without having to worry about authentication. We'll get to that at a later lesson. And then I'm going to say that this is constrained. What this does, you can see this right here, it creates a foreign key constraint on this column referencing the ID column of the conventionally related table. What that means is it's grabbing the user ID and then saying it's going to exist within the user model, the user table within our database. And then this is something you might normally do within an application. I'm going to have this cascade on delete. Now, what does this mean? It means that anytime a user is deleted, their chirps are then deleted too. All right, that's the...
I'm not sure I have that. I want to see here. See if I can make improvements to any migration improvements.
the most wordiest column in our database migration for here. So the next ones are going to be simple. We just need a string. And in this case, this is just what it says. It is a string of characters that we can enter into our database. The first parameter is going to be what that name is. I'm going to say this is a message, and then we can pass an optional parameter of how much this string of max characters should it have. And we're going to say this is 255. And then, like you might have seen, Laravel already provides the timestamps and ID columns automatically generated for this migration, which is great out of the box. We don't have to touch this. This timestamps is a created at and an updated at column. So we might even see that in our database right here, where if I was to go into something like our users, we have a created at and an updated at timestamp. Back to the chirps table. Now, how do we make this migration file that we created actually then exist in our database? Well, it's simple. We open up our command line again and we type php artisan migrate.
So author will be the name, message, and time. Okay.
You see here, it created that chirps table, or actually it ran the migration, which in turn created the chirps table. This is
all right. So if we go over here, now we have chirps.
is a schema that created the chirps table with these particular columns. Now that we have our migration entered into the database, we have that new table, there's different ways that we can interact with the database. Before we create any UI elements to be able to interact with the database on our web application, we can do interactions with the database manually. Now this is where the AI tooling that Laravel provides as a first-party extension, Laravel Boost, is fantastic. It has tools out of the box to be able to have your AI interact with your database using the tools that Laravel expects. What does that look like? Well, Laravel has Tinker, which is PHP Artisan Tinker. What this does is allow you to interact with your database using Laravel commands. So I could say something like db select, and we're going to select, and this is raw SQL queries. We could say something like select star.
All right, let's see here. They do this by default. Make Tinker install by default. Now let's just kind of move that down. All right. Okay.
From chirps. And
so I think I do have that. So I have to figure out what's my equivalent of doing that. So DB they have that. Okay. So there's nothing there.
And yeah, there's nothing there because we haven't added any chirps yet. But There's other ways to interact with your database. You might have seen I already pulled up this database.sqlite, and VS Code and other IDEs might have a database viewer extension that you can install, open up, and be able to interact with the database there. And while most of these tools that are built into IDEs or extensions for IDEs like VS Code, they're usually just great for viewing things that are in your database, and that is handy. But there's also another visual approach like Table Plus or something like dbeaver or any other GUI editors for a database where you can point it to your database file and then.
So let's go ahead and just register. Okay. Couldn't find driver. That's interesting. Let's keep going.
And be able to interact with it. For example, I could create my own chirp manually within this Table Plus GUI. Now I'm discarding all those changes because we don't necessarily need to interact with the database manually for right now. It's just helpful to know that either using AI or a tool or even something like PHP Artisan Tinker, we could use these tools to create new chirps in the database before we even create code to do that. One thing I did want to point out, we create this foreign ID for a user ID table, but you might be thinking, hey,
Let's see here. That's interesting. That's probably because I didn't restart the computer to reload the service, but somehow the command line was happy with it. Gotta love Windows. All right, I'm logged in.
We didn't actually create that migration, right? Well, that's something that Laravel gives us out of the box. And you saw that we had that users table in our database.sqlite viewer. So if we were to click into that create users migration, we're creating a users table with a string of name, a string of email that has to be unique, and all of this is pretty readable for us. We have a timestamp that is email verified at, which could be nullable, and then a string of passwords. So there's a bunch of different tables that are created in this one migration, but it's helpful to know that Laravel does provide some of these tables out of the box, including users. So that's why we didn't create our own users table migration. It's just automatically using what Laravel's set up. Now, before we continue, I do want to note that Tinker can be used with what we call Eloquent. This is Laravel's way of interacting with the database in a more clean manner. Now, this isn't necessary to grasp all at once. It's just helpful to know that there are other ways of interacting with the database other than using that DB facade. In this case, using select queries that has SQL language, and that might be confusing for you, but it's just helpful to know that there is a more eloquent, and that's actually the name of the tool that we interact with the database within Laravel, of being able to select or even create things within our database. Again, you don't have to worry too much about everything that you're learning right now. We're going to talk about it in more depth later, but for your first Laravel application, just know that there are easier ways to do almost everything within Laravel. And before we move forward, I do want to manually create a chirp with PHP Artisan.
All right, we already did that.
Mostly to show you that there's an easier way to do it in the next lesson, an easier way to interact with our database, even with the tools that Laravel gives us through models, but that's for next lesson. But also to show you that Tinker, or any way that we're interacting with our database, is a great use case for something like AI. Within Laravel Boost, there's tools that allow you to work with Tinker or allow your AI assistants to work with Tinker. You don't need.
So I think what he's going to try to do is something like, so read. All right.
Need to know all of these syntax for how to interact with the database through Tinker, but it's helpful to know what your AI or even what specific commands might do. I'm going to type this all out here and then later paste it into Tinker. So we have DB table chirps, so we're entering into the chirps table for selecting the chirps table and then inserting a message of my first chirp in the database. And because we don't have a user, we can just leave it off of this DB table. The DB is a facade that Laravel gives us to more easily interact.
So I think I can do something similar here. So what? Let's see what he does. Okay, he's going to do just insert. So create. And then let's do equal. No, 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 no. Because I don't have a model, I have to do something different. So ID. I believe that is a function. Globals, where are you, globals? All right, so I do have a now function. All right, create that. And then DB. There you go.
Interact with the database instead of having to write those SQL queries that we wrote previously. But we do have to put created at and updated at as timestamps because Laravel doesn't give those by default. I'm going to clear this out, copy it, and then in PHP Artisan Tinker, I'm just going to paste that in and press enter. And we get this true
Yeah, you
back.
can do that
so that
too.
means that this was successful. This.
So let's see here. Just Windows is just so slow. So I can just pretty much do this. All right. What did I do before? there we go. Okay. I am not an idiot after all.
Chirp was now entered into the database. So we could pull up our database, see this chirp, and see here, yes, this message was created, my first chirp in the database. But we can also do that in Tinker as well. We could say db table chirps get. And there we go. Here's our first chirp. Congratulations, you just entered something into the database using a command line tool. I'm going to exit from Tinker. There's two commands I want to make you aware of within the PHP Artisan namespace. That's migrate fresh, which means if you absolutely made a mistake, or maybe you just need to change an existing file, which is not the best way to do it, but if you're not in production, you can do whatever you want. PHP Artisan migrate fresh will drop everything and then create everything from scratch. So in this case, we don't have that chirp that we just created. Another one would be PHP Artisan migrate rollback. Now, if we created a new migration, in this case, maybe the chirps table, and we wanted to roll that back, it would run the down structure. If I was to go into that chirps table migration, we have this down structure. And here, this is going to drop the chirps table. It's going to run this migration if we ran this migrate rollback. So if I do that, because we ran everything, we now don't have anything.
Or you can do this. There's no more chirps table, and then that record is now created with the table.
Anything in our database. So I'm going to run PHP Artisan migrate again. So you now have a real database with the ability to create real things in that database, in this case chirps, because we gave it a table, we gave it a proper structure, in this case a message, and then a relationship to users. And next lesson, we'll dive into what does that relationship actually mean. This is where that M of MVC comes into play, the model structure. So if you've thought that this is a little bit confusing because working with queries and stuff like that,
all right, so this is a good stopping point. So we did the whole database thing. So now we can do that is good. So we stopped at 4816. So 3529, 4816. And I think that's a good stopping point. And the next time we'll go over how they do models and see if there's anything that we can do to upgrade my version of working with models. Until next time, we'll be back tomorrow, February 7th, and that's it for this video. We will see you next time.